Hello and welcome to a special episode of It's Not Rocket Science, the podcast from the Innovation Launchpad Network Plus, which shines the spotlight onto our researchers in residence. For this episode, I spoke to Paul Howard-Jones, Professor of Neuroscience and Education at the University of Bristol, and Energy Systems Catapult's Becky Wilkes, who is working alongside Paul on his researcher and residence project. This is a two-parter. I tried to edit it down, but I simply couldn't. It's so fascinating. Paul discusses using psychology and neuroscience to drive change in consumer behavior when it comes to new technologies. For context, I mentioned George, as Paul rather hilariously appeared under that name when he jumped on the call. I don't know whether it's a Jedi mind trick from Bristol's answer to Darren Brown or a simple case of using someone else's email address. But come to think of it, I do feel a little bit out of sorts since we recorded this. Anyway, before we dive in, let's give you a brief overview of the Innovation Launchpad Network Plus, the funders of Paul's project. The Innovation Launchpad Network Plus, funded by the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, the EPSRC, brings together leading universities, the Catapult Network, and regional innovation ecosystems and enriches the exchange of ideas and knowledge across these organizations. One of the ways we do that is through the Researcher in Residence scheme. And this really is a flagship activity for our network. For those who don't know, we award up to £50,000 to researchers in the UK whose research proposal fits within at least one of our key themes, which are netzero, resilience, and healthcare and wellbeing. These projects are awarded on a collaborative basis, meaning that it is a requirement for researchers to work alongside at least one of the catapults. And you can find out more about the catapults and the Catapult Network over on innovationlaunchpad.ac.uk. Thank you very much to you both for joining us today. Could I ask where you are, how you're doing, what you're getting on with today? What's your plans for the day? Paul, I guess we'll start with you, or / George, your grandfather's account.
Well, my name's Paul Howard-Jones. I'm a Professor of Neuroscience and Education, but the last few years I've spent a lot of my time applying that in various areas related to sustainability. And today I'm actually chairing a meeting of the department's Climate Action Group. That's what I have to go to in a minute after this interview.
Ah, brilliant. And Rebecca?
Grant. So I'm Becky Wilkes. I lead the research, consumer research activities at the Energy Systems Catapult, which is part of our consumer insight team. So our remit is really to make sure that we kind of recognizing that people are at the center of our sort of transition to net zero is to really kind of put people at the center of that. So understanding what people need from energy, from different technologies and services and so on. Kind of relaying that to the energy sector so that we can really make sure that everyone's brought along on that journey and that it works for people. So my day-to-day is a lot of research and asking questions of people, of energy innovators, and finding out kind of what's important to them, or maybe trialing a product, a service with people. So the rest of my day is knee-deep in reviewing sort of surveys and focus group materials so that we can start to understand, in this case, some financial products that might support people in kind of investing in some low-carbon technologies for their home. Basically, I'm is being nosy in like understanding people and what makes them tick.
Yeah, that kind of chimes in nicely with your project, doesn't it, Paul? Obviously, we're going to talk about your research and residence project today. Could you perhaps give a little outline of what you're aiming to do with what's your research project about with the Energy Systems Catapult?
Well, I mean, the basic idea is quite simple, really, that we are having trouble. I mean, there are, say trouble. Our sales of some types of innovative energy technology are not as great as they should be in the UK. And I'm thinking here of, in particular, heat pumps, for example. And I suppose the idea is that we may have some insights from psychology and perhaps even from neuroscience to understand how people engage with these new products and how we can foster and encourage them to think about acquiring one and maybe even acquire one. That's the basic idea. I mean, it gets a bit more complicated than that because, but we started off with a simple idea.
He's doing himself a disservice. It's very simple to explain at that level, and when you start to what all of the things he's doing underneath that. Oh my goodness, there's a lot in there.
Right. So I guess, yeah. So from your perspective, from the Catapult perspective, Rebecca, how does that project kind of chime in? You basically already touched on it, but yeah, how does that chime in from your perspective?
Oh, I mean, this is one of the projects I'm sort of most excited about at the moment, or perhaps that we've run for a little while with the Catapult, because I think for a long time we've really recognised in the energy sector that consumers are important to that transition to net zero. We really can't get there without them, right? It's dependent on people sort of using energy and behaving in certain ways. And at this point, there's been quite a lot of work done in understanding some of the more kind of practical needs that people have around energy, and some of the kind of more, I suppose, rational perceptions of the technology. But we've never had a really good grasp of the kind of the broader factors that drive people's behaviour. And we've never had any kind of framework to really understand what makes people tick. All of those things you can't articulate. And that, people, one of the things that fascinates me the most about people is we never do what we say we're going to do, ever. And we would be hard pushed to explain why that's the case. So to be able to really kind of lift the lid on some of that and understand some practical ways we can work with consumers and support them to move forward towards net zero is a fabulous opportunity. I'm really looking forward to finding some of the things that come out of this.
So, Paul, you kind of touched on the fact that it started as a sort of a simple idea, but how, you were kind of alluding to the fact that maybe it's changed. So what are the findings so far? How has it gone?
Yeah, I mean, I think what makes it, one of the things that makes it complicated is that you're not just sitting in a laboratory trying to solve a problem with 25 participants or whatever and trying to test a hypothesis. This is much more about knowledge creation in terms of synthesizing insights from a variety of different areas. And what the psychology and neuroscience is adding is, as Becky alluded to, is this idea of the thought processes and the emotional response of the consumer. And there isn't actually a lot of research on that in a psychological sense, but we do have consumer research, saying how people behave, and that's different to understanding the underlying processes, which are important if you actually want to apply this, these insights and try to get somewhere with it. So, first of all, it's a matter of scanning the literature, trying to bring stuff from those insights from the science and make contact with the consumer research. But there's also this issue of communication within the industry as well, which is something I know we'll probably talk about this in a minute when you ask me what were the particular challenges. I'm sure. That's the basic idea was to look at the science, bring it to people in the industry, CEOs, people working in consumer relations in energy companies, people working in local authorities, have conversations with them about those insights, and then use those interactions to guide the research for the next iteration of the report. In other words, kind of like co-producing the report, but in a way which doesn't require massive input from industry, because these people are very busy and trying to get time with them. It's not always easy, but still finding a way to produce something in the end which is aligned with their priorities. Because there's a whole lot of things you can bring in that I think are important, but that's not really the issue. It's what industry thinks is important and what they think they can use and what will be helpful for them in terms of consumer relations. And so the idea was to work iteratively around this cycle of looking at the science and then taking it back to the review and developing a review like that. And also, of course, along the way, you're picking up the language. I mean, this is really important because you're picking up the language and the way in which people talk, people outside the laboratory. And so that's giving insights into how we can communicate these insights as well.
Yeah. I'm just going to delete what are the challenges from the from the running.
Oh, I've got plenty more actually, Paul, so don't worry.
Okay, let's go on. What are the challenges?
Okay, so you are asking me now what are the challenges? Yeah. Okay, well, I think the first thing was engaging with industry, because if you phone up a CEO and you say, I'm a neuroscientist and I'd like to talk to you about consumer relations, it's like, well, it's a little bit off radar, it's a little bit left field. I'm not really sure this is actually my top priority for the day. And you can sort of, in a way, that what you're hoping for is some sort of cultural change almost, whereby not only are companies going to raise consumer relations generally as a priority, but they're also going to start taking an interest in approaching that issue scientifically. So I didn't realise what a big ask that was really when I started. So trying to engage industry was particularly difficult, and it would have been completely impossible, I have to say, without the Catapult Network, who were really helpful in that regard. But we did make progress with it, and we got through the first iteration. But then we decided to change track, and I think this is one of the things that is probably worth emphasising, really, because you start down these roads. I'm grateful to Catapult for being flexible enough to allow this to happen. And you realise that this original plan that you had, now you know so much more about how to communicate with people in the energy industry. You realise that the plan you have doesn't really necessarily make sense, because the communication aspect became, we're already heading towards this point where we need to create a tool. And it just didn't make sense for me to be doing that with just Rebecca, really, because there's a whole raft of people who have a lot of more expertise in this area of communication than I do. And it's a matter of working on a wider venture, if you like. And so what we've done is to change the second year. It was a 2-year project, and change the second year so that I am now working much more collaboratively with Catapult. In fact, we had a meeting, it's just last week, wasn't it, where colleagues at Catapult got around the table, and I was there, and we were talking about these insights, and we were talking about, okay, so how are we going to package this up? What are the messages? What are the sorts of messages? Actually, this is just one of a few meetings we had, but what are the messages, and how are we going to communicate them? And actually focusing on that, realizing that that's probably a year's project in itself, and therefore bringing that forward and getting on with that seemed a greater priority than doing another one of these iterations of interviews with people in industry. So we've had to be flexible. In terms of talking to industry, it got to the point where what I did eventually was go to a conference, the netzero conference, and have a stall there. And I'd even printed up leaflets and things, to give out, saying, I can't remember, it was something like, look inside the consumer's brain, or something like that, something kind of trying to engage folk with that. But of course, inevitably, that what really worked was just going up to people in coffee breaks and talking to them and interviewing them. That's easier, really. And awful lot of the data was actually collected at that conference, quite spontaneously, and that really helped to guide things at that point.
Yeah, I think that, as you say that, it reminds me of kind of why that pivot on our second year was so important. It's so hard to get hold of energy folk that are this work is pertinent to, because they are so busy, and particularly if you think some of the kind of the energy innovators, they're perhaps running smaller businesses, they're trying to do all sorts of things all the time. We at the moment we have a report that summarises work, and I think it's brilliant. I'm going to read all 20 odd pages of it because I get the benefit and I've got the time. But working ways to distill that to land with that audience who are already time pressured, and as Paul says, is quite low down, or perhaps on their lower down on the priority list, to kind of turn it into something actionable you can really easily digest and kind of see how to apply it, is that kind of the next step that really solves that gap, that problem.
So my next question is for both of you. What is the next steps, and what's the kind of end goal with these? How do you cut through to not only the industry, but also to the people at home who they may just think they're too busy to think about heat pumps at this moment in time, but actually is really important for the future?
Yeah.
So we've had a meeting whereby folk at Catapult were looking for links between the science and what we already know, because that's quite important. Because if it doesn't align with what we already know, then there might be an issue. there with the science, or it might be really interesting and it might be just the sort of added value that you want, but it's something that needs to be discussed. So that's been really helpful, and actually it did quite comfortably align. And the additional thing, I think, the added value is the fact that the science kind of adds a concreteness really to an area, and I'm talking about sort of customer relations, really, an area which some members of industry probably think of as a bit fluffy sometimes. I don't know if Rebecca would agree with
That's exactly the word I use for it. That is naturally very data-driven and quite a bit engineering. Can I have that as a word? But in its character is quite, it ticks a lot of those sort of stereotypes. So to come in with this kind of fluffy people stuff can be a little bit like, ooh, not very familiar with that, don't know quite how to engage with it. So fluffy is exactly the word I would use for it as well.
And when you can point to images of the brain with activities in them that tell you actually something is going on here, which is backing up some of this consumer research and maybe adding something to it, I think that's really exciting, and it's additionally engaging and will help not just to develop the insights but also to communicate them. So that was reassuring. And then the meeting we've had just recently has been, okay, we think we've got some things we want to say. How are we going to say them? And we've only just had that meeting, and I know that Rebecca's got a whole pile of notes and things from it.
There were lots of ideas from that meeting.
That's hopefully going to coalesce into an idea for a project that we're then going to get on with in terms of making a tool. This is the thing we've been talking about, a tool. I'm not sure what this tool is yet. But that's where we are, really. We're actually working on that at that stage of the impact. At the same time, I should say, we're also looking at some other more. I'm looking at deriving some data from public commentaries, on this, like discussion boards, which you have to be a bit careful with because they are sometimes they're a bit radical and. But also possibly looking at alternative sort of ways of communicating these things, maybe through broadcast. So I'm going to be approaching one or two people that I've found particularly helpful in the way in which they articulate about these concepts, who are in industry, to see if they want to participate in a podcast, a bit like this one.
Hey,
so thumbs up for podcast. So that's also going on, but the main focus is now on this tool.
But is that the same for you, Rebecca, from the Catapult perspective?
It is. So there's the kind of distilling down, I suppose, what that tool is and looks like. Bringing together the folk in the Catapult and understanding what we think might be best suited with the feedback that Paul's already had from the energy sector, and kind of tying those together to create an as yet unspecified tool. Like, we're getting a bit closer on what that looks like. So that's our sort of short-term thing to really bridge that gap between this really interesting report and, okay, but what do I do with that in my day job? Yeah. Within the workshops that we sort of facilitated internally to think about, right, what's next? How do we use this? Well, there were all sorts of interesting ideas there as well. So this is timed really nicely with our organisation kind of planning for next year. So I'm taking the opportunity to kind of seed some ideas for new products and tools, and, well, this is a very concrete word, some new ideas, I suppose, things we can do longer term as well. I can see so many different applications for this. We've started thinking about consumers, but also as an organisation, the Energy Systems Catapult really is trying to kind of drive change, right? Enable this transition. So there's perhaps other ways we can do that beyond thinking about how we talk to consumers. How do we work with our partners in the energy sector? How do we influence other areas that address this challenge? So all sorts of applications. It's kind of distilling down to the couple that make most sense and are going to have most impact right now, and kind of focusing on those first. So I think back to this project, it was like, we could do this, we could do that, like a child in a sweet shop.
Yes,
but a lot of fluffiness going on. That's great.
Would it be helpful to sort of give an example of what we mean? Because I'm just starting to listen to this. I think this is all a bit abstract, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, so one I looked in the literature about behavioural change, and particular interesting for me was some studies that have shown how in health research, when you're changing your diet, you're trying to give up smoking, what you say you're going to do is not such a good predictor as the amount of activity in a region of the brain called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is just at the front, towards the bottom. It's an emotional processing center. And it seems to be about effective foresight. It seems to be about imagining how you're going to feel in the future. And if you're doing that, if you're imagining how you're going to feel in the future, that region of the brain activates. So it's a good marker for the fact that you're thinking about yourself in the future and how the actual experience of this. In other words, you're being realistic and you're planning it out. And that sort of activity in the brain indicates that you are probably going to actually make that behavioural change. So they have done it with respect to environmental behaviour. They haven't done it with respect to buying a heat pump, but the same principles probably apply. And interestingly, talking to people in industry, one of the things that came up was one company, because you are finding, and this is the thing, you're finding pockets of really good practice. This is what I sense anyway, Rebecca, that I don't know if you agree with me on this, but you find some companies that are really ahead on this and they are really thinking forward. And there was one where they're actually employing a psychologist in customer relations. And she was saying, what we've found to be really helpful is that we take around a mock-up of a heat pump and we actually bring it into the person's house and we put it there in the corner. And people find that really helpful. Well, of course it would, because it's encouraging them to think about what it would be like to live with a heat pump. And not that the heat pump is in the corner, actually, of the room, it's outside, I should say. That's a slight technical. But they put it outside and you can imagine, therefore, sort of living with it more easily. And that seems to encourage people and supports them in actually committing to this journey, which is quite a long journey sometimes. It can be quite an emotional, cognitive journey of purchasing a heat pump and changing the system that they're using to heat their house. So you've got the science then backing up a customer relations strategy. And that's the sort of strategy that we probably want to draw attention to other companies to. So they're doing sort of similar things. Or since we understand now how that works, maybe doing it in other ways. It could be like a virtual reality simulation or something like that. But anything that encourages people to imagine and supports their imagination seems to be helpful.
Absolutely. Paul also identified some what I found were really interesting insights and strategies towards building trust. So we know that consumer trust in the energy sector is probably not where it could be. It's a little bit lower than we'd like, and that people who our research consistently shows that when we test new ideas with consumers, those who already trust their current supplier, even if it's not the person who would be supplying this new thing, are generally more up for it. They can see the benefits. They are more keen to have a go, certainly on paper in surveys. So being able to improve the consumer trust in the energy sector right now will have a real impact on uptake of heat pumps, other net zero technologies and services as we go forward. But there's some really clear kind of levers that we can pull from even right down to the way that someone in a call center speaks to a customer and how they interact, and the consistency of that between interactions in an organization. There is really obvious kind of levers and steps we can take to build that trust now, which will reap rewards for the sector right now, and going forwards as well. So it's going to be a case of drawing those out so they can make them really obvious and actionable for people.
So one thing there is that the science points to two circuits in the brain when you're developing trust. One is for working out, is this a good deal that's on the table? And the other one is, can I trust this person? And both of those, but particularly the trust the person, are quite sensitive to inconsistencies. So that really underlines the importance of something which, a lot of customer relations people will tell you is important, but it helps emphasize it because we've got the science behind it, that having people talking to the same person, the same personnel, the same staff member or at least making sure that all the staff members who are talking to customers are using the same language, the same concepts, and have the same knowledge, and they're transmitting it in the same way, is really helpful for building trust. And then when the trust is violated, because or the customer feels it's been violated, which is, it's quite common. It may not be within the control of the company sometimes for customers to feel that. What do you do about it? Well, when you have trust violation, there's a network in the brain called the default mode network. This is a network that encourages us to think about ourselves. We suddenly become a bit more defensive and we think, well, what should I be doing in this situation? And the default mode network activates. And what's interesting is that if you provide prompt, attentive compensation for the injustice that has been caused, that can actually help decrease activity in that default mode network. So in other words, it's decreasing that sense of violation of trust. So that's great. But actually, if you overcompensate and you pay more money or you give more attention than really the trust violation deserves, that actually activates the default mode network again, and people become less trusting of you. So making sure that the compensation is proportionate appears to be really important. And I think that's an additional sort of insight that's come through from the neuroscience that actually isn't in the customer relation literature at the moment.
I think we'll call it there for part one, folks. I'm sure you're eager to hear more from Paul and Becky. In part two, we'll discuss ADHD, Paul's career journey and Becky's career journey, and the one scientific both of them would like to create. A small spoiler, it's already in testing in pigs. Okay, bye.